All right, hands where I can see him. Stay right there. We got a call about a suspicious individual with a
A
child.
call? Officer, I'm just having coffee with my son. What is this about?
Your son. That kid doesn't look like your son. Is this child
Sir,
in
you need to
danger?
provide identification for both of you right now.
Are you serious? This is
I don't
profiling.
have to prove he's my child to sit here. Back.
Let the kid go. Hands on your head where I can see him. You're under arrest. This is the documented incident report for case 734-B. On the afternoon of May 14, 2023, at precisely 3:47 p.m., an event transpired within the confines of the Gilded Bean, an upscale coffee shop in Chicago's affluent Lincoln Park neighborhood that would serve as a stark case study in the high cost of prejudice. The incident, captured in its entirety by 3 high-definition CCTV cameras and later supplemented by police body cam footage, documents the confrontation between Dr. Marcus Thorne, a 38-year-old FBI special agent, and Frank Miller, a 42-year-old off-duty Chicago Police Department officer. Dr. Thorne was spending a quiet afternoon with his 5-year-old adopted son, Leo. Miller, operating on a single, flawed, and racially charged assumption that a black man could not be the legitimate father of a white blonde-haired child, accused Dr. Thorne of kidnapping. This baseless accusation, born of deep-seated bias, triggered a chain of events that resulted in Officer Miller's immediate termination, a criminal indictment for a hate crime, and a civil judgment against him totaling exactly $1,200,000. The following is a detailed, moment-by-moment reconstruction of how one man's bigotry led to his complete and quantifiable professional, financial, and personal ruin. The day had begun with an almost cinematic tranquility. The Gilded Bean was an oasis of calm, the air thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans and baked pastries. Sunlight streamed through the large plate glass windows, illuminating the floating dust motes and casting long shadows across the polished concrete floor. The low hum of the espresso machine and the quiet murmur of conversations provided a soothing soundtrack to the afternoon. At a small table near the window, Dr. Marcus Thorne was demonstrating to his son, Leo, how to properly dunk a biscotti into a cup of hot chocolate without it crumbling. Dr. Thorne, a man whose professional life was a carefully orchestrated sequence of high-stakes investigations and meticulous analysis, cherished these mundane moments of fatherhood. His movements were precise yet gentle, his focus entirely on the small boy with bright blue eyes and a dusting of cocoa powder on his nose. He had adopted Leo 2 years prior, a decision that had reshaped his world in ways he was still discovering. His career at the Federal Bureau of Investigation demanded a level of emotional control and situational awareness that was second nature to him, but with Leo, that professional discipline softened into a patient, protective warmth. He was explaining the physics of absorption with a mock-serious tone, and Leo was giggling, his small hand wrapped around the oversized mug. To any impartial observer, the scene was a perfect portrait of paternal affection, a quiet moment of connection between a father and his son. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, a minor imperfection in the otherwise pristine environment, casting a cool, almost clinical light on the forms and receipts scattered on the counter. It was a detail Dr. Thorne's trained eye registered and dismissed in the same instant. His focus remained on the present, on the simple joy of a shared treat, entirely unaware that he was already under hostile surveillance. His competence was a quiet, unassuming force, visible in the way he calmly navigated the small space, the way he spoke to his son with respect, and the way his posture, even when relaxed, maintained a subtle readiness. He was a man comfortable in his own skin and in his role as a father, a picture of normalcy that was about to be violently shattered by a prejudice that refused to see the truth in front of it. The decision that would irrevocably destroy Frank Miller's life was made in the 5 minutes he stood watching them from across the room. He had entered the coffee shop not for coffee, but to escape the heat, his mind already soured by a recent departmental reprimand. The service record, which would later be entered as evidence, detailed a troubling pattern. 14 citizen complaints in 10 years, 3 for excessive force and 5 for verbal abuse, all of which had been dismissed with a simple warning. Miller saw the world through a distorted lens of suspicion and aggression, a worldview where his authority was absolute and his instincts were infallible. When his eyes landed on Dr. Thorne and Leo, his internal narrative was instantaneous and absolute. The visual discrepancy of a well-dressed black man with a white child did not trigger curiosity, it triggered a conviction. He saw not a father, but a predator. He saw not a child's affection, but a victim's fear. He mentally dissected the scene, twisting every innocent gesture into a piece of evidence for the crime he had already imagined. The gentle way Dr. Thorne wiped chocolate from Leo's chin was, in Miller's mind, a calculated act to keep the boy quiet. The shared laughter was a performance for the public. For 5 minutes, he stood there, his jaw tightening, his self-righteous anger building like a pressure cooker. He made no attempt to speak to the staff, to observe from a different angle, or to consider any alternative explanation. His prejudice was a closed loop, a self-fulfilling prophecy. He had already tried and convicted Dr. Thorne in the court of his own bias.
As he finally began to move toward their table, his path was set. He was not an officer of the law seeking to protect and serve. He was a man on a mission to validate his own bigotry, an act of supreme arrogance that would cost him everything he had. Frank Miller moved with a predatory certainty, his shadow falling over the small table like a shroud. The ambient warmth of the coffee shop seemed to chill by several degrees as he approached, his presence a discordant note in the room's gentle symphony. Dr. Thorne, whose senses were honed by years of threat assessment, detected the hostility before Miller was even within arm's reach. He didn't tense up. Instead, a profound stillness settled over him. He subtly shifted his weight, placing his body more squarely between the approaching man and his son, a quiet, instinctual act of protection. Miller stopped directly at their table, planting his feet wide. He loomed over them, his expression a mask of self-righteous conviction. He ignored the child completely, his eyes boring into Dr. Thorne with an accusatory fire. The question, when it came, was not a question at all, but an indictment delivered in a low, menacing tone. "Whose kid is this? Tell me the truth." The words hung in the air, thick and ugly. Dr. Thorne met his gaze without flinching, his own expression one of mild, controlled curiosity. He kept his hands visible on the table, a deliberate, non-threatening posture. "He's my son," he replied, his voice calm and even, a stark contrast to the coiled aggression before him. "We're just having a snack. Is there a problem, sir?" The honorific was a calculated tool of de-escalation, an offering of respect that was immediately and violently rejected. Miller scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. "A problem? Don't play dumb with me. I've been watching you." The boy looks terrified. This blatant fabrication, a projection of his own internal narrative, was the first clear sign that logic would have no purchase here. Dr. Thorne's training kicked in, telling him this was not a misunderstanding to be clarified, but an agenda to be managed. "Sir, I can assure you he is perfectly safe. He is my legally adopted son. I have his digital birth certificate on my phone, along with dozens of family photos, if it would put your mind at ease." He made a slow, deliberate motion toward his jacket pocket. Miller's hand shot out, not to touch him, but in a sharp, dismissive gesture. "I don't want to see your fake documents." His voice began to rise, drawing the attention of other patrons. Heads were turning. A barista paused, her hand hovering over the steam wand. The entire room was becoming a theater for Miller's prejudice. "I know what's going on here. Men like you, preying on kids." The accusation was now public, a poison injected into the quiet afternoon. Dr. Thorne calmly withdrew his hand, letting it rest again on the table. He was no longer just a father. He was a specialist managing a volatile subject in a public space. He refused to take the bait, refused to let the man's venom provoke an emotional response. He glanced at Leo, who was now looking from his father to the angry man, his blue eyes wide with confusion and fear. The attempt at a quiet resolution had failed. Now, containment was the priority. He knew the man's next move would be a critical escalation, and he prepared for it, his mind a quiet, cold engine of calculation. The public nature of the confrontation now defined the rules of engagement. Several patrons had discreetly angled their phones, the small red recording lights winking on like malevolent eyes. The evidence trail was already beginning. Dr. Thorne registered this fact and adjusted his strategy. His primary objective remained the safety of his son, who was now clutching his arm, the joy of the afternoon completely extinguished. He placed a reassuring hand over Leo's, giving it a gentle squeeze. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured, his voice a low, soothing vibration meant only for his son. "The man is just confused. We'll sort it out." Then he looked back at Miller, his gaze firm, his tone shifting from conciliatory to formal. "Sir, you are creating a public disturbance and you are frightening my child. You have made a baseless and deeply offensive accusation. I am now asking you to identify yourself or to step away from our table immediately." This was not a plea, but a directive. It was a verbal line drawn in the sand. Miller, however, saw it as a challenge. His face flushed with rage. The calm authority in Dr. Thorne's voice was something he interpreted as the arrogance of a criminal caught in the act. He puffed out his chest, his off-duty officer instincts, warped by years of unchecked aggression, taking complete control. "Identify myself? I'm the one stopping a kidnapping. You're the one who needs to answer questions." He pointed a thick, trembling finger at Dr. Thorne's face. "You think you're so smart, sitting here in this fancy place, but I see you. I see what you are." The words were a torrent of pure, unadulterated bias. There was no logic to appeal to, no reason to be found. Dr. Thorne made one last attempt, his voice a model of restraint. "Sir, if you genuinely believe a crime is being committed, the correct and legal procedure is to contact the Chicago Police Department by dialing 911. Let uniformed officers come and assess the situation. That is the proper way to handle this." He was offering Miller a final off-ramp, a chance to defer to procedure and mitigate the damage he was causing. But for a man like Frank Miller, his own judgment was the only authority he recognized. He let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, I'll call them, don't you worry. But first, you're not going anywhere." He began to raise his phone, but then his eyes darted down to Leo, and a terrible decision solidified in his mind. He shouted the words that would be broadcast in news reports for weeks. "Let the kid go! Hands on your head where I can see them! You're under arrest!" In that instant, he lunged, not for Dr. Thorne, but for the small boy cowering behind him, his hand reaching for Leo's arm in a flagrant act of assault. An error in judgment that would cost him everything. What would you do if you were in Dr. Thorne's shoes, facing a baseless accusation that was escalating into a physical threat against your child? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The confrontation reached its critical point as Miller's lunge became a physical act of aggression. His hand shot out, not towards Dr. Thorne, but towards the small, trembling form of Leo. In that split second, every protocol, every piece of training Dr. Thorne had ever received coalesced into a single, fluid motion of pure defense. He didn't strike back, he simply moved. Rising from his chair with an explosive calm, he used his larger frame to create an unbreachable barrier between Miller and his son, absorbing the man's forward momentum. His left hand came up, not to push, but to gently guide Leo behind him, while his right hand met Miller's outstretched arm at the wrist, stopping it cold. The contact was firm, decisive, and devoid of violence. It was a block, not a blow. At this moment, Dr. Thorne's strategic passivity evaporated, replaced by an unmistakable aura of command. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer conciliatory. It was a blade. "Step away from my son. Identify yourself officially, now."
The words sliced through the tense silence of the coffee shop. Miller, his assault thwarted, recoiled as if burned, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. The shift in power was palpable, but he was too far gone in his self-righteous crusade to recognize it. "I am the police," he bellowed, his voice cracking with fury, a desperate attempt to reassert the dominance he had just lost. "And you're under arrest, pal." This was his final fatal doubling down. The declaration hung in the air, a testament to his unbreakable prejudice. It was the moment his ruin became a mathematical certainty. With a precise economical movement that spoke of years of practice, Dr. Thorne reached inside his jacket. He did not retrieve a weapon, he retrieved his identity. The leather credential case was flipped open with a quiet snap. The identification inside, bearing the Golden Eagle seal of the Department of Justice and his clear professional photograph, was unequivocal. "Negative," Dr. Thorne stated, his voice level and cold, each word a hammer blow effect. "You are a citizen acting outside your jurisdiction and your judgment. I am Special Agent Marcus Thorne, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And you have just committed, in sequence, unlawful restraint, racial intimidation, and are about to file a false police report, all of which is being documented by the security camera directly above your head." He tilted his head slightly, indicating the small black dome of the CCTV unit on the ceiling, its tiny red light a silent, impartial witness. Miller's eyes followed his gaze, and for a fleeting instant, a flicker of raw panic crossed his face. The credentials, the title, the mention of the camera, it was a tidal wave of reality crashing against his fortress of bias. But his ego, a brittle and oversized thing, refused to crumble. It was a fake. It had to be. He snatched his phone from his pocket, his thumb jabbing at the screen as he dialed 911, his voice a strained, desperate shout to the dispatcher. "I have an aggressive and possibly armed individual impersonating a federal agent." The call was completed. The police were on their way. The shrill cry of approaching sirens sliced through the tense stillness of the Gilded Bean, a sound that for Frank Miller was the triumphant fanfare of his vindication. He stood with his chest puffed out, a smug certainty settling on his features as he watched the flashing red and blue lights painting strobing patterns across the cafe's large windows. He had done his duty. He had cornered the criminal, and now the cavalry was arriving to put the man in cuffs. He glanced at Dr. Thorne, expecting to see fear, but found only a disconcerting, almost placid calm. Dr. Thorne had one hand resting gently on Leo's shoulder, his posture relaxed but alert, his eyes fixed on the entrance. He was not a cornered suspect, he was an observer waiting for a predictable procedure to unfold. At precisely 4:03 p.m., the door swung open and two uniformed Chicago Police Department officers entered, their movements swift and professional. The lead officer, a burly sergeant with salt and pepper hair and the weary eyes of a 20-year veteran, had his hand resting on his holstered weapon. His body cam, a small black square on his chest, was active, its lens capturing the scene with an unblinking, objective gaze. The sergeant's eyes swept the room, taking in the scared faces of the patrons, the agitated off-duty officer, and the composed man standing protectively over a small child. His training took over, filtering out the noise to assess the threat. Dr. Thorne, recognizing the protocol, made no sudden movements. He slowly raised his empty hands to shoulder height, a universal sign of non-aggression. "Special Agent Marcus Thorne, FBI," he stated clearly, his voice carrying across the room without a tremor. "My credentials are on the table. I advise you to run my name, badge number 7749, through the National Law Enforcement Telecommunications System for verification." The sergeant, whose nameplate read Evans, nodded curtly. He gestured for his partner to cover him as he cautiously approached the table and picked up the leather credential case. He never took his eyes off Dr. Thorne. He spoke into his shoulder mic, his voice a low, professional monotone as he relayed the information. The response from dispatch was almost instantaneous, a crackle of audio that was crystal clear on the body cam recording. The shift in Sergeant Evans's demeanor was immediate and profound. His shoulders relaxed. He lowered his hand from his weapon. He looked from the credentials back to Dr. Thorne, and the suspicion in his eyes was replaced by a dawning recognition, then professional deference. "Agent Thorne, Sergeant Evans here. We're aware of your assignment in the city. Situation is under control." He then turned to his partner. "Stand down." That simple command was the sound of Frank Miller's world collapsing. The validation he had been so certain of had been given not to him, but to the man he had accused. The body cam footage later showed Miller's face go slack, his smug expression melting into a puddle of disbelief and then raw, stomach-churning panic. He took a half step back, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air. Sergeant Evans exchanged a few quiet words with Dr. Thorne, then turned his full, unimpressed attention to Miller. The body cam zoomed in slightly as Evans walked toward him. "Frank Miller, I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back. You are being detained pending an investigation into unlawful restraint and filing a false report." Miller's protest was a weak, sputtering thing, his authority utterly stripped away. He was disarmed, his off-duty weapon secured in an evidence bag, and his wrists were bound in the cold, unforgiving steel of his own department's handcuffs. The click of the cuffs was the final, definitive sound of his career ending. This is the moment justice arrives. If you believe accountability is essential, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to see the full, quantified consequences of one man's prejudice. The shrill cry of approaching sirens sliced through the tense stillness of the Gilded Bean, a sound that for Frank Miller was the triumphant fanfare of his vindication. He stood with his chest puffed out, a smug certainty settling on his features as he watched the flashing red and blue lights paint strobing patterns across the cafe's large windows. He had done his duty. He had cornered the criminal, and now the cavalry was arriving to put the man in cuffs. He glanced at Dr. Thorne, expecting to see fear, but found only a disconcerting, almost placid calm. Dr. Thorne had one hand resting gently on Leo's shoulder, his posture relaxed but alert, his eyes fixed on the entrance. He was not a cornered suspect. He was an observer waiting for a predictable procedure to unfold. At precisely 4:03 p.m., the doors swung open and two uniformed Chicago Police Department officers entered, their movements swift and professional. The lead officer, a burly sergeant with salt and pepper hair and the wary eyes of a 20-year veteran, had his hand resting on his holstered weapon. His body cam, a small black square on his chest, was active, its lens capturing the scene with an unblinking, objective gaze. The sergeant's eye swept the room, taking in the scared faces of the patrons, the agitated off-duty officer, and the composed man standing protectively over a small child. His training took over, filtering out the noise to assess the threat. Dr. Thorne, recognizing the protocol, made no sudden movements. He slowly raised his empty hands to shoulder height, a universal sign of non-aggression. "Special Agent Marcus Thorne, FBI," he stated clearly, his voice carrying across the room without a tremor. "My credentials are on the table. I advise you to run my name, badge number 7749, through the National Law Enforcement Telecommunications System for verification." The sergeant, whose nameplate read Evans, nodded curtly. He gestured for his partner to cover him as he cautiously approached the table and picked up the leather credential case. He never took his eyes off Dr. Thorne. He spoke into his shoulder mic, his voice a low, professional monotone as he relayed the information. The response from dispatch was almost instantaneous, a crackle of audio that was crystal clear on the body cam recording. The shift in Sergeant Evans's demeanor was immediate and profound. His shoulders relaxed. He lowered his hand from his weapon. He looked from the credentials back to Dr. Thorne, and the suspicion in his eyes was replaced by a dawning recognition, then professional deference. "Agent Thorne, Sergeant Evans here. We're aware of your assignment in the city. Situation is under control." He then turned to his partner. "Stand down." That simple command was the sound of Frank Miller's world collapsing. The validation he had been so certain of had been given not to him, but to the man he had accused. The body cam footage later showed Miller's face go slack, his smug expression melting into a puddle of disbelief and then raw, stomach-churning panic. He took a half step back, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air. Sergeant Evans exchanged a few quiet words with Dr. Thorne, then turned his full, unimpressed attention to Miller. The body cam zoomed in slightly as Evans walked toward him. "Frank Miller, I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back. You are being detained pending an investigation into unlawful restraint and filing a false report." Miller's protest was a weak, sputtering thing, his authority utterly stripped away. He was disarmed, his off-duty weapon secured in an evidence bag, and his wrists were bound in the cold, unforgiving steel of his own department's handcuffs. The click of the cuffs was the final, definitive sound of his career ending. This is the moment justice arrives. If you believe accountability is essential, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to see the full, quantified consequences of one man's prejudice. The validation he had been so certain of had been given not to him, but to the man he had accused. The body cam footage later showed Miller's face go slack, his smug expression melting into a puddle of disbelief and then raw, stomach-churning panic. He took a half step back, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air. Sergeant Evans exchanged a few quiet words with Dr. Thorne, then turned his full, unimpressed attention to Miller. The body cam zoomed in slightly as Evans walked toward him. "Frank Miller, I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back. You are being detained pending an investigation into unlawful restraint and filing a false report." Miller's protest was a weak, sputtering thing, his authority utterly stripped away. He was disarmed, his off-duty weapon secured in an evidence bag, and his wrists were bound in the cold, unforgiving steel of his own department's handcuffs. The click of the cuffs was the final, definitive sound of his career ending. Sergeant Evans' body cam footage, later submitted as Exhibit C in the civil trial, captures the precise moment Frank Miller's world imploded with an almost clinical detachment. As his partner secured the handcuffs, Evans began the official process of documentation, his voice a flat, procedural monotone that offered no hint of sympathy. He recited the potential charges as if reading a grocery list. Unlawful restraint, a Class 4 felony in Illinois. Filing a false police report, a Class 3 felony when it involves an accusation of a major crime. And, potentially, a federal hate crime charge, which would be determined by the U.S. Attorney's Office in collaboration with Agent Thorne's superiors. Miller, his face pale and slick with sweat, finally found his voice, a pathetic whine that was a stark contrast to his earlier aggressive bellows. "Wait, you don't understand. He was acting suspicious. The kid didn't look like he belonged with him. It was a textbook kidnapping scenario." Sergeant Evans did not even dignify the excuse with a direct response. Instead, he turned to the barista, who was already providing a statement to the other officer, her voice shaking but clear as she recounted Miller's unprovoked aggression. He then gestured to the other patrons, several of whom immediately confirmed they had been recording the entire incident on their phones. The digital evidence against Miller was not just from official cameras. It was a mosaic of civilian recordings, creating an unassailable record of his prejudice-fueled actions. The sergeant then knelt down slightly to speak to Leo, his voice softening for the first time. "Hey there, little man. Everything is okay now. You're safe." Leo, still clinging to his father's leg, just nodded, his wide eyes fixed on the man who had terrified him, now being treated like a criminal. This small act of kindness was another public repudiation of Miller's entire narrative. He had claimed the child was a victim of Dr. Thorne, but the real trauma, inflicted by Miller himself, was now the central focus of the official response. As he was led out of the coffee shop, the flashing lights of the squad car illuminating his stunned face, Frank Miller had no idea that the public humiliation was only the first and cheapest installment in the total price he was about to pay for his prejudice. The wheels of a justice he had so arrogantly claimed to represent were now turning against him, and they would grind his life into dust with methodical, documented precision. The fallout for Frank Miller was not a gradual decline. It was a catastrophic collapse, a controlled demolition of a life built on a foundation of unearned authority and unchecked bigotry. The process began the moment the steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Within 72 hours, the Chicago Police Department's Internal Affairs Division concluded its investigation, an open and shut case built on an insurmountable mountain of digital evidence. The 3 CCTV angles from the Gilded Bean, Sergeant Evans' pristine body cam footage capturing the entire official interaction, and no fewer than 7 separate cell phone videos provided by patrons created a 360-degree undeniable record of Miller's actions. There was no room for interpretation, no ambiguity to exploit. His termination was immediate and unconditional. The official letter cited gross misconduct, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming of an officer, severing his 18-year career. With that single signature, his annual salary of exactly $105,000 vanished. His health benefits were terminated. Most devastatingly, his pension, the financial bedrock he had been building for nearly 2 decades, was forfeited in its entirety. A forensic accounting report submitted during the civil proceedings calculated the projected lifetime financial loss from this termination alone to be in excess of $3 million. This was the first payment on a debt he had incurred in a single afternoon of hate. The administrative consequences were merely the prelude to the legal storm. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office, facing immense public pressure and possessing an ironclad case, moved swiftly to indict. Miller was formally charged with unlawful restraint, a Class 4 felony, and filing a false police report, a Class 3 felony. But the most significant charge came from the federal level. The U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, in direct consultation with the Department of Justice and Dr. Thorne's superiors at the FBI, added a federal hate crime charge under 18 U.S. Code, Section 249. This elevated the case from a local police matter to a federal issue, signaling that Miller's actions were being treated as an assault on the civil rights of all citizens. His legal team's attempt to negotiate a plea bargain was flatly rejected. The prosecution was determined to make an example of him, ensuring that the consequences would be as public as the offense. While the criminal case moved toward a trial he could not win, the civil hammer fell. Dr. Marcus Thorne, seeking not revenge but accountability and a means to repair the damage done to his son, filed a civil lawsuit. The suit detailed claims of defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and gross violation of civil rights. Faced with a public trial where the viral video of his client's meltdown would be Exhibit A, Miller's attorney advised him to settle immediately. The final judgment was a precise and crippling figure, $1,200,000. The settlement was meticulously structured. $750,000 was awarded directly to Dr. Thorne for the public humiliation, the direct threat to his and his son's safety, and the slanderous accusation of kidnapping that now existed in a permanent public record. The remaining $450,000 was placed into a protected trust fund for Leo. This money was earmarked for any long-term psychological counseling he might require to process the trauma of the event and to fund his future college education, a tangible way to turn the ugliness of the incident into a guarantee for his future. To satisfy this judgment, Frank Miller's life was liquidated. His Lincoln Park condo, valued at $450,000, was sold. His truck, worth $55,000, was repossessed and sold at auction. His savings, a meager $22,000, were seized. After all assets were exhausted, he still owed over $600,000. A court-ordered lien was placed on all his future earnings for the next 30 years, ensuring that a significant portion of any income he ever made would be garnished and sent directly to Dr. Thorne's legal representatives. He was left with nothing but the clothes on his back and a debt that would follow him to his grave. In stark contrast, Dr. Thorne's life continued its upward trajectory. The FBI conducted a perfunctory review and formally commended his exemplary conduct and restraint under extreme provocation. He continued his work on a high-profile counterterrorism task force in Chicago, his reputation for calm analytical competence enhanced. Weeks later, he and Leo were seen in Millennium Park, laughing as they took pictures by the Cloudgate sculpture, a father and son whose bond, tested by hate, had only grown stronger. Frank Miller's ruin was absolute, a perfect and documented equation where an act of pure prejudice resulted in the sum total of his own destruction. Did he finally learn that bigotry has a price, a real, quantifiable, and devastating cost? The court documents and bank ledgers provide the only answer that matters.